Ahead of the movie later this month, and Help Wanted 2 in December, I think it's time we talk about one of the biggest unsolved mysteries in all of Five Nights at Freddy's. You've seen the title. We're not here about any Tales from the Pizzaplex bullshit. We're not here about guessing the plot to Help Wanted 2. We're not here for Midnight Motorist. We are here to figure out if William Afton fought in Vietnam. First and foremost, we gotta look at the timeline. This whole idea falls apart if his age doesn't make any sense. Using the FNAF timeline, our earliest given date is, of course, 1983. We know plenty of things occurred before then, but we don't know for certain when. We don't have a year. So 1983 is what I'm going to go off of, and you'll see how in a moment. Now, the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War was from 1965 to 1973. We had some military advisors present in South Vietnam prior to 65, but I highly doubt William would have been a U.S. military advisor, so 65 is our earliest relevant date. So, time to figure out if his age lines up with those dates. In 83, William has 3 kids. Young, but they're not like toddlers. Michael is the oldest, making him the most relevant for figuring out William's age. We don't have specific ages for Michael or his brother, and also his sister, I suppose. We just know Michael is older. In my mind, Michael is 12 and his brother is 8. There could be a little range, like Michael could be 13 instead, and his brother could be up to like 10. But I don't see Michael being 14 or older. I know I'm only operating off of vibes here, but there's no way he's a high schooler. In any case, William needed to be old enough to have a kid in that 1970 to 71 range. For my vague research, it seems mid-20s was the average age for first-time fathers around that time. And there isn't really anything in the games to argue against this. At least if you ask most people. MatPat places William as being born in I think the 20s? That's just kind of insane. By my estimate, William was probably born around 1945. In 83, he's near 40, which I think totally makes sense. I've gotten away from the Vietnam part of this, but I'm sure you have figured that his age checks out. He wouldn't have been too young to be drafted, even right at the start in 65. Of course, age isn't the only reason one might not have been drafted. And in fact, I'm sure there's something you've probably been thinking this whole time. We gotta talk about William being British. Obviously, all of the time we spend with him in the games, he's in the United States. And we know he must have been here too before 1983 in order to build everything up and establish it, so it seems pretty safe to assume he became a US citizen early in his life. But judging when is pretty much impossible, because there's nothing that indicates anything in any direction. Nothing about if he came over and then had kids, if he had kids and then came over, if his own parents were the ones who came over. There's just nothing. The only thing I could maybe use is actually what MatPat used to try and make William be born way earlier, which is the Singing Bear Show poster we see in Security Breach. Assuming this was an actual thing that is older than the stuff prior and not just a black and white poster from the 70s, then it would make sense for William to have spent a significant amount of his younger life in the US to be able to have come across it. That's a stretch, but there really is nothing to go off of. Absolutely nothing to indicate when he might have become a U.S. citizen. Since there isn't anything indicating he became one too late to be drafted, though, I'm still going to be operating off the assumption that he was eligible. It's just more fun that way. Hold on. It just occurred to me that the rough birth year I gave him would lead to it making a lot of sense for his parents to have fled Britain years prior because of World War II. I think that's the case now. His parents immigrated to the US because of the war, which is why he's British but in the US. And my judgment would have him being born in the US, meaning he's a US citizen by birth. I think that's actually a pretty reasonable explanation for why he's a British man living in the US. That's not something that, needs explaining. But with how perfectly it lines up with his age, I think it works way too well to not be the case. I'm a genius. So there's absolutely no problem with him being British. He was definitely a citizen and definitely was eligible to be drafted. Alright, so what else is there? Well, there's 3 things that could still get in the way. Attending college, being a conscientious objector, and dodging the draft. College doesn't really mean a ton. College students were less likely to be drafted, but it didn't keep them from being drafted. And there's also the assumption that William wouldn't have wanted to be drafted, which goes for the other 2 as well. I doubt he was a Quaker or religious at all, so it seems unlikely he would have been a conscientious objector. He still could have chosen to dodge the draft in other ways, but they all seem unlikely. Emigrating to Canada or elsewhere doesn't really add up, nor does enlisting in the Coast Guard to avoid action, since he had to get up to plenty of stuff in the 70s. There also isn't anything to indicate he would have been considered physically unviable for service. Not to mention, nothing about William comes across as the kind of guy who would have been opposed to the war. That's really the biggest thing. He just seems like a guy who wouldn't have minded being drafted too much. There really isn't anything that gets in the way otherwise either. I would even say it wouldn't be that surprising if he actively volunteered. One of the bigger things here, though, is that Henry also very likely fought in Vietnam. He maybe wasn't, as willing as William probably would have been, but I think overall, he has less reason to not have been eligible. So, my proposal is that him and William were war buddies. Maybe mechanics or some other less combat-focused role, but I bet they served a tour together. And that's how they came to know each other. Maybe during that tour is when they had the idea to form a business together. Maybe that was later on after, when their friendship continued. It actually makes some sense as a motivation to start a kid-oriented pizza place to sort of combat the baby killer stigma that followed returning vets. Not that it would have been unlike William to be cruel, but that's getting into judging exactly when the serial killer tendencies started, which is a whole other thing. If either of them were actively a war criminal, though, it definitely would have been William. I'm not actually making a judgment on that. Thumbnails just for fun. If I did, I would be stepping into some probably highly insensitive territory. We're not doing that. If you are a gay Michael and homophobic William believer, then how's this? William and Henry developed a particularly close relationship under the stress of war, but once they returned home, William grew disgusted with himself for that, which is why he's so homophobic to Michael, and perhaps why he came to hate Henry too. Much to think about. That's all silliness. But my overall point is I think it actually makes a lot of sense for William and also Henry to have fought in Vietnam. It makes sense from a timeline perspective. It makes sense for establishing this relationship, and there's hardly anything that would indicate otherwise. Now, having said that, it's not as though the whole eligible population was drafted to fight. The chances of it being like that neither of them were is more likely. And them meeting and founding a restaurant together doesn't need some kind of special circumstance. But I do genuinely think it's interesting to consider that this did happen, especially when nothing implies otherwise. Maybe the two picked up and honed some mechanical skills while they were over there. Maybe the war affected William deeply enough to impact how he viewed the world and life. Maybe his partnership with Henry only worked when under the stressful conditions of war, and so it deteriorated as time went on back home. I just think it's a really interesting thing to consider. And unless they come out and say that he canonically didn't, I'm going to continue to think that William Afton did fight in Vietnam.